Hello everyone and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Today is Ash Wednesday, which means that if you belong to a liturgical church, all of your co-workers and fellow students have been telling you today that you've got a little something on your forehead. Very appropriately, I'm drinking a very penitential glass of water on this interview. And in this interview, we're going to be talking about the dispute, or supposed dispute, between C.S. Lewis and St. Augustine, which we read about this season in The Four Loves. Now, we spoke about this back, I think, in Season 3 with Dr. Jason Lapoyavi, but since we've just read the text, I wanted to bring on another expert to talk us through this dispute and possibly even try and resolve it for us, and even apply some of the lessons from this to what Lewis and what Andrew thinks is Lewis's best book, Till We Have Faces. So, Dr. Joseph Zepeda, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thanks, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, would you mind introducing yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a Roman Catholic. I teach at Thomas Aquinas College, which is in California, in the U.S. And I spent the last 12 years at another college teaching in a similar curriculum, so sort of classical liberal arts curriculum with a Thomist flavor here at Thomas Aquinas College. And my specialty as a scholar is actually more early modern philosophy and science and their relationship, but I have a long-standing interest in Augustine and have been reading Lewis since childhood. So that's the sort of relevant background, I think.
And did you begin with Narnia, or was it something else of Lewis?
Yeah, certainly with Narnia as a child, and then I don't remember the timeline with precision, but I think I started reading as I got into adolescence, the Screw Tape Letters, Mere Christianity, and the Space Trilogy, or at least the first two volumes.
The last one's a bit weird. It's okay.
Yeah, I didn't really understand that till I was a bit older, I think, frankly. And then relatively late got to Till We Have Faces. But somewhere in there, in my adolescence, I read The Four Loves, and then have gone back to it many times since then. Yeah, so it's been, Lewis has always been part of my intellectual life, I think. Yeah.
And we'll be talking about Till We Have Faces a little later, and I think it's good that you got to that fairly late. I do not think that is a book that somebody should get to too early in their reading of Lewis.
Absolutely.
So how did you come to write a paper on C.S. Lewis and St. Augustine?
Well, I think like many others, I found this part of The Four Loves very striking and very moving and powerful, and it's the one that stays with you after you've read it. So you remember that passage where he talks about how to love it all means to be vulnerable. So then in going back and reading the Confessions a number of times and in discussing it with those who had read it many more times than I came to start wondering whether that was exactly what was going on in that part of the Confessions, the way Lewis characterizes the moral that Augustine is drawing. I wasn't sure that was quite right. It seemed like there was maybe a little bit of cross purposes or a little bit of a difference. And so that's how I came to start thinking about that more deeply. I mean, as with the passage in The Four Loves, this part of the Confessions is very moving, and it's powerful. His depiction of his grief at the loss of his friend, that also stays with one. Mm-hmm. But it's not extremely easy to understand what he's doing with that recollection when he goes back to that moment, and then the reflections he starts to develop in the ensuing chapters. So it made me both moved, but also puzzled, and made me want to understand better. So that's where this paper came from.
And now I'm going to assume that anybody watching this video, anybody that listens to our podcast, has read this chapter of The Four Loves. But let's just say that they hadn't read it. What is Lewis's issue with what Augustine says in his Confessions?
Yeah, so I guess to start with the point he's seeing there in Augustine, or that he's attributing to Augustine. In Lewis's view, Augustine thinks back to this moment in his life where he experienced all this heart-rending grief at the loss of his friend, and he draws a moral, which is that you shouldn't give that kind of love to anything mortal because you're going to lose it, and it doesn't serve your happiness to put all your happiness into something that will be lost. And so the sort of moral to be drawn from that grief and disappointment and heartbreak, in Lewis's view, Augustine is drawing this moral that, but if you love God, the object of your love is secure and can never be lost, and it's an eternal and immortal and so on. And so that it's a moral about choosing the proper object of your love on the grounds of security. And Lewis says that has a certain logic to it, but it doesn't seem like love.
Yeah.
Love is not about security, and to understand love, you must understand that it's about breaking through or having somebody else break through your desire for security and protection of yourself against entanglement, against the possibility of disappointment, against vulnerability. So, I mean, the words are striking, and the thought they indicate is profound. He says, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything in your heart will certainly be wrong and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. And he goes on and discusses what will happen to your heart if you keep it safe from love, so to speak. Mm. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. And the only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. Which is, I mean, he really drives the point home. It's hard to forget that passage, and you don't want to forget it either.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite passage out of the entire book. And I had started reading Augustine before the first time I read this book, and so I was already a bit of a fan. So I raised an eyebrow when he said he was going to disagree with him. But both at the time when I read it, I'd actually just gone through a breakup, so the phrase "to love at all is to be vulnerable" was very real for me. And the time that we're going through it now on the podcast, I now have a wife and a son, and I know that is really true. To love my wife, to love my son is like a little piece of me, a little piece of my heart is now out there in the world, and I can't protect it all the time. So yes, it's really moving. But did he misunderstand Augustine? Because in your paper you start pointing out some issues with Lewis's understanding of what Augustine says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is where I started to dig in and started to feel like maybe that isn't quite the moral Augustine is drawing, and it's tricky in some ways because Augustine is pointing out, he is praising the security of the love of God. There's no question about that. But it seems to me, and this is sort of where I felt like I must be onto something correct here, and thinking that there's a mismatch here, is at that point in his life, his love for this friend is the best thing about his life. It's the most real thing that he's loving. His friend is more real and actually more eternal than the idea of God that he had at that point in his life. So that the moral that he's drawing about, sort of, if you think about it, that's retrospectively, like, what should I have done? What should I, the young Augustine, have done at that point? His point, he's not saying, I should have just sort of disdained all human love and turned to God. Partially because his idea of God at the time was materialist and inadequate, and as part of his Manichaean phase. So right away, you could see there's something that doesn't quite line up, because Augustine discusses the possibility of just turning to the love of God at that moment. And there he affirms that his love for his friend was that he was loving the most divine thing he knew at that moment. So he's not retrospectively saying, like, I should have turned away from this guy. I shouldn't have been so close to him. I should have been less attached to him, and so on. In fact, in a very dramatic scene, he recounts the young man on his sickbed. Augustine's visiting him, and what's just happened is that the young man has been baptized while unconscious, and Augustine starts making fun of that. That, how could anybody think that would do anything? You're sitting there unconscious, and they just pour some water on you, et cetera, et cetera. And his friend says, stop talking that way, or I need to send you away. He looks at him as if he's his enemy. Those are the words Augustine uses. So there, I think you see there's a way in which he wasn't too attached to the young man. He you start to see in that scene, he actually didn't know how to love him fully because he didn't understand what his good really was, what it consisted in. And he didn't understand the sense in which his friend was already was participating in an eternal life, was beginning to really participate in the eternal life of God. And that because of that, he was actually loving him less than he ought to. So that you start to see a little bit of a disconnect. The point is not, wow, I was really loving this guy too much. It's, I actually didn't know how to love him enough. And I was actually turning myself into his enemy at the time.
And he's committing the very mistake that Lewis repeats again and again throughout the Four Loves, that love, when it becomes a god, becomes a demon. Our loves, as Augustine repeatedly says elsewhere and in that book, that they have to be rightly ordered. And exactly. he didn't know God, so this was the pinnacle of his loves. But because it was the pinnacle, it was therefore deficient. And it wasn't to be solved by loving his friend less, but by loving God more, which is the very, very thing that Lewis says in that final chapter of the Four Loves.
Yes, absolutely. So that I had the strange feeling that as I was seeing more of a disconnect between Lewis's diagnosis of this moment, I was reading the Four Loves and the Confessions as more and more closely together in the way that Lewis and Augustine are thinking about love and the relationship between human and divine love. Because just as you say, the point is not to turn away from the friend and love God. The point is, I can't love the friend in accordance with who he really is, in accordance with what is good for him, unless I'm loving God.
As MacDonald says in The Great Divorce, the one good is God, and everything is good when it turns to him. It's just another way of expressing this idea of rightly ordered loves. One other question I had is, do you think Lewis possibly mixes up these different friends? Because he has quite a bit of tragedy in the Confessions, and I'm not always sure if he's actually identified the right situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. He actually, at this point in the Four Loves, talks about this friend as Nebridius, who is in fact a different person than the young man who dies in whose death is described in Book 4 of the Confessions. So I think you're right that in reaching for this example, Lewis had overlaid certain things in his memory of the text and Augustine's life. And I don't want to fault him too much for that, because I think it's easy to do that. And it's an interesting fact about the Confessions that almost nobody is named by their proper name until about halfway through the book. And even there aren't a whole lot of names that are brought into the narrative, which is another topic for a whole other discussion that has to do with the way in which it is and is not a biography and so on. But yeah, so Nebridius plays a significant role in Augustine's life, and Augustine describes that in later books. So it's certainly not the same person as the young man who is not named, whose death is described so movingly in Book 4. But I think part of what Lewis is remembering is the power with which Augustine describes his grief at the death of his friend. But that I think was there, sort of throbbing in Lewis's memory of this text.
It's funny. I would say the same thing, but for me, it was the death of his mother. That is my favorite passage. I mean, obviously, Restless Hearts at the beginning, and when he speaks about God, you roared, you shouted, you broke through my deafness. Obviously, those bits are amazing, but the other passages that really stick with me from the Confessions are when he's speaking about his mother, particularly before his conversion, when he's lamenting as to how badly he treated her, but then finally when it comes to her death.
Yes.
Yeah, Augustine, he knew his way around a sentence, even in Latin.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's really instructive to compare those two passages, the death of the friend in Book 4 and the death of Monica later on, and to compare what he says about his grief in the two cases is really that. I feel like I still have not plumbed all the depths there, but it really does start to shed light on the whole work, I think, to consider. Well, because in a way, the Confessions is about Augustine's whole life, but it's strange as biography because he stops talking about his life and then starts talking about scripture towards in the last three books.
Oh, and that section on time. Oh, my poor brain.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's quite interesting that he starts talking. He gives you a little like sneak preview of that section on time in book 4, right after the depiction of his grief at the death of his friend. And so I think that's quite important. That episode is more than just a very moving moment in his early life. It has sort of a little key to the whole work and how it hangs together. But that and the death of Monica, I think, because there he's sort of taking stock of somebody's whole life in relationship to God's eternity. And so those are sort of moments where you see a little microcosm of the whole Confessions, I think. So I think Lewis was absolutely right to have in mind that part is so powerful, and it's so crucial. That's the part that I'm going to remember and bring back to mind. Even though I'm disagreeing a little bit with how he sees the moral drawn, I think there's a good reason this is what came to his mind.
And I remember the first time I dug into this, I actually kind of reached the conclusion that I'm actually okay with Lewis making this mistake, because firstly, I think it produced the best chapter of the entire book, and the best moral, that to love at all is to be vulnerable. But also, Augustine isn't always brilliantly easy to understand, so it's very easy, I would say, for somebody to read the Confessions and to walk away with the same impression that Lewis did. So just the very fact that Lewis has this corrective out there makes me happy. But I'd now like to turn to the latter part of your paper, because what you do is you then start talking about Till We Have Faces. Why did you bring that up?
Yeah, well, I found it so fascinating. As I said, in some ways, even as I became more convinced that there was a little bit of a misinterpretation here, in thinking further about that, it made me see more deep connection and agreement between Lewis and Augustine. And then that continued in thinking about, when I was thinking more about the role of reflection on time and eternity in this part of the Confessions and in the whole Confessions. And then the sort of really beautiful and staggering things that Lewis says sort of along similar lines in Till We Have Faces. So I don't recall the exact timeline of when I started to see connections there, but it made me look more closely to see, like, well, it seems like he's saying something like that Until We Have Faces, and then I just it started to come together. And so it's in Augustine, I think you could put it this way: in thinking about his friend and in what was lacking about his understanding of his friend and his love for his friend, that leads him to reflect on how it is that we're supposed to love a mortal being, and how do we understand the existence of a mortal man, and how do we love a mortal man. And the reflection he develops sort of in embryonic form there, and then reflects on further in books 11, etc. He starts to develop the idea that what we apprehend in a sort of scattered and piecemeal way in time is, in God's eternity, existing in its fullness. The fullness that God intends for the human being can only be understood and apprehended in reference to the eternity of God's word. So that the word that speaks creation into existence and the word that redeems fallen creation is also the key to understanding how a human being is one being, rather than a sort of scattering into the differences of time, so to speak. It's hard to talk about that latter stuff without sounding sort of, I don't know, wooey or mystical or something. I don't mean those in pejorative terms, but I feel like I start to run out of language. And I think Augustine does too. Even Augustine starts to run against the limits of language, talking about your word, which goes forth without changing, which sounds without sound, and so on. But then this happens Until We Have Faces too, that there's a vision of Psyche as both different, but also more herself than she ever was in Orual's memory of her. So Lewis even goes so far as to talk about sort of all the different psyches sort of together as one full being. So what I think both Augustine and Lewis are in the end moving towards is this understanding that to love somebody in their fullness, right, which is both to understand what they really are in the truest sense and also to be able to desire their good, what's really good for them in the final sense. So to understand them in their fullness requires understanding them as moving into God's eternity, as proceeding from the eternal word and returning to the eternal word, and that's where you understand the fullness of a human being's being, and that's how you can love them in accordance with what they truly are and desire what's truly good for them, which is what he wasn't able to do with his friend, which is what Augustine was not able to do with his friend in his early life that he recounts in Book 4, and also what Orwell fails to do with Psyche. So in both cases, you have kind of the seizing upon somebody as the love that tries to grapple one soul to another with hooks of steel, right? Mm-hmm. But if that's done without reference to how the person is a whole unified being, then it ends up pulling the soul apart, to use Augustine's language. So you see kind of the metaphor there that you try to grapple the two souls together, but you don't know how to do that without tearing apart the person if you're loving them in the wrong way, in a way that involves selfish adherence in the here and now of time, rather than moving together towards the eternity of God.
Such is the way that Orwell loved Bardia. She loved him, but she consumed him. She drained the life away from him because it wasn't in reference to anything higher. And that's the line in The Four Loves where Lewis, when he's finally getting to his point of explaining what is this other thing that needs to marshal the natural loves, he said, it's decency, it's virtue, and actually the entire Christian life in one particular relation, in that relationship with God. So with that as your anchor, as your base, as your entire ordering process, everything else then starts falling into place. But without that, we don't love people well, because we'll make those loves and those people our gods, and they inherently have to become demons.
Yes, well said. I completely agree.
Well, I'm really pleased. Well, I'm going to put a link to your paper both in the show notes here and on our website. Do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up? Anything you'd like to advertise? How to let people know how they can contact you if they want to dispute your claims?
Yeah, well, you can find my contact info at the website for my college at thomasaquinas.edu, and I'd be happy to hear from anybody who's interested in it. I don't have anything to advertise, but I guess I would close with this, that it seems to me that Till We Have Faces is Lewis's finest work.
And I have endless battles with Andrew. I think it's The Great Divorce, and I really resisted giving Great Divorce examples, but it's okay. Please carry on.
That would have to be many other conversations, I think, to fight that one out. But maybe we can agree on this, though. It's one that really, really rewards returning to over and over again.
And it's definitely, I would say it's easily his deepest work. It's the one that you really have to just keep peeling the onion, and it just keeps going.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Dr. Joseph Zepeda, thank you very much for coming on Pints with Jack.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And everyone, please join us next time when we'll go further up and further in. Cheers.